Hello everyone, this is Dr. Rangel. In this video, I'm going to walk you through how to read an academic article. And we're going to talk through two different articles. One is a qualitative article, so the data were collected from interviews with participants. And the second one is going to be a quantitative article. They're a little bit different, so we'll kind of talk about those differences and I'll give you some additional tips. The first thing that I want to talk to you about is this software called Zotero. Zotero is similar to EndNote. There's other softwares probably out there that do similar tasks. Zotero is a reference organizer. I highly recommend that you download either Zotero or EndNote or something similar as soon as you can. EndNote costs money, I believe. Zotero is free. Zotero has an online or in the cloud version, but you can also download it onto your desktop. And that way, this what I'm looking at right now on my screen, and you can see on my screen, is the desktop or laptop application. You can see over here I have lots of folders. This is my library. And then over here, so right now we are in a folder labeled Minority Serving Institutions. And here we have titles and authors. So for example, here we have a journal article, the title, the authors, and the abstract, the publication name, volume, issue, pages, and date. You can manually enter all of this information, or you can go to your favorite place to look up academic articles. Mine is Google Scholar. And let's look for, let's look for an article by one of my colleagues, Ruth Lopez. And there's another Ruth Lopez who works over at Rice University who's coming up. And what you can do, we'll click on this first one. This is actually from the woman at Rice. And if you're logged into the university library page, you'll get a lot more access to these articles. What I can do, instead of typing in all of this information manually, if you will, when you download Zotero, install the plug-in. This is the plugin right here. And all I have to do is click on this, and it'll take a second, but it will save the article and all of its information automatically to Zotero, which is just a huge time saver. The second thing that Zotero will do is, when you are typing an article, so for example, this is not an article, but this is our syllabus. Let me open up another blank document. Let's say I've written some stuff. It's incredibly amazing, insightful, what I've written, and I am ready to cite it. I have Zotero open. You can see I have a Word document plugin as well. You click on this tab here, and I'm going to add a citation. And this insightful piece of, we're going to have the APA 7th edition, this insightful piece of information that I have just written, we're going to say, we'll just take this one right here. Let's say it's these folks right here. Click on it, we hit enter, and there it is. And the nice thing is then I get to the end of my article or my paper, and I say, please add a bibliography. Boom, there it is. You just save yourself hours of work. And you say, what in the world does this have to do with reading an article, Dr. Rangel? Wasting our time. Wait, wait. Here it comes. The other thing that you can do is that you can take notes in here. So, oops, I'm going to get rid of this one, but I'll show you here. So I take my notes right into Zotero. And if you save the information right from Google Scholar, it'll actually also save the PDF. And I can link to it right here. So Zotero is your friend. I hope you will download it, explore it, install all of the add-ons. It will make your life a lot easier. You're going to start using it right away with our ongoing readings. So let's jump into an article. This is by a colleague of mine, the Indiana University. This is one of my areas of interest, leadership for science and math instruction. And so here we have the title, the journal information. This is not actually up to date, but normally once it's up to date, it'll have additional information about the volume, the issue, the page numbers. Then it has the abstract. This journal, EAQ, Educational Administration Quarterly, has these nice structured abstracts. They kind of make sure that the author tells you the purpose, the research method approach, the findings, the conclusions. I highly encourage you, if Zotero does not already save this, that you save this so that you can always go back quickly and say, what was this article about again? Oh yeah, right here. It's in the abstract. Then there's some keywords. Also recommend adding these here. So if you go back to the information, I can put in some tags. And so these are those keywords. And this will help you look for keywords across your folders. All right. So the most basic way to read an article is to just read everything. Read the whole thing. But even that is probably not going to be sufficient, because the question is, it's 30 to 40 pages. What's the most important? What should I take away from this? What do I do with all this stuff I just read that maybe put me to sleep partially or gave me a headache? After you take your Tylenol or Advil, then we'll go back and we'll read it more strategically. So at the very beginning of most articles sets the context. What's the issue? What's the problem? Sometimes there'll be a little vignette. Sometimes there'll be a description of, there'll be some statistics, some sense of how are we situating this paper? What broader conversation is it contributing to? So you can see here we have this question of, secondary school, instructional leadership, kind of who's helping teachers. And as we come down, we see this paragraph starts here. This is actually a shift from sort of, here's the context for why I'm writing this article, to here's the actual reason I'm writing this article. And this is important. We'll talk more about this as the semester goes on. But what the author is doing here is he has identified what we call a problem, a weakness, a gap in similar research. So research on instructional leadership, he's arguing, focuses mostly in elementary schools. And he's just made the case to us that elementary schools and secondary schools are quite different because of departmentalization and specialization of knowledge. And so then he says, so what we know about how principals and maybe assistant principals and other administrators, how they lead instruction or guide instruction in their schools is going to be different in elementary and secondary schools, but we don't really know what those differences are. We don't have research that covers that. So what he's done is he's highlighted this gap. He's sort of said, this is the problem in the research that my study is going to address. So what do you do with that? So I think it's always important to read the introduction with relatively carefully so that you have a sense of, again, that broader conversation and a sense of what is supposedly going to be the contribution of my article to this broader conversation. And it's what he lays out here. And then he says, here's the problem. And then he has this, and not all studies are going to have this, where he has this nice purpose of the study. But in the purpose of the study, what he's saying is, well, I told you about the problem. Here's how I contribute to our understanding. And he lays that out. When you are thinking about how do you translate this reading into notes, I encourage you to use headers and outline. For example, I'm going to pull up my Zotero again. Here are those notes that I was taking. What you can see, these notes are sort of some of the background, and then I have some headings that I've borrowed probably from the article, and I start to fill in information from the article. So here you could have a bullet that says purpose of the study, and you could pull out a direct quote. If you pull out a direct quote, make sure you cite it with the page number, and you put in quotes what is actually taken directly from the article. And then you keep reading. So now you know the problem, the purpose. We get into this thing called the literature review. The literature review is basically, what do we already know about this topic? What have other researchers written? And what is important to take away is kind of what are the broad points? And this article is very nicely, has very nice headings and subheadings. So defining instructional leadership. What's instructional leadership? So make sure that you take notes on what's the definition, or what are the definitions? There may be more than one. What does it mean to supervise classroom instruction? What are the main points that prior researchers have made? If you're reading in a PDF, as I like to do, remember the tools that you have. So let's say here, we want to make sure that we highlight this, because this is a really important part. So it's highlighted, and then we hit save. So we can come back and skim this later if we want. You can also drop in comments, a sticky note, a note to yourself. Maybe I'm going to put in a note here that says, this is really important and I should use in my paper. It's a little reminder to yourself. Make sure you use all the tools available to you. So we keep going through the literature, and what you want to be able to take away is the basic idea, the main points of what did we already know going into this paper about instructional leadership. The role of principal feedback and data. So how we use data to give good feedback to the teachers we supervise. We keep reading. This is all prior research. So that's, again, take notes on what did we know going into this. With this section, we shift gears again, and this could be a section that says theoretical framework, conceptual framework, theoretical approach, theoretical perspectives. This is basically saying, how am I going to approach addressing the problem that I identified at the very beginning of the article. So here he says he's going to utilize this idea as content as context. So this idea that what is being taught matters and shapes instruction and the types of instruction we expect, what we think of as good instruction. And then he has this other sort of concept idea, leadership, content, knowledge. So leaders need to know more than just how to supervise. They actually have to know something about the content. And the question is, well, what do they need to know? So you want to make sure that you have a good understanding. Excuse me. I'm glad that's on video. We have a good understanding of what these two concepts are, because these concepts are going to guide his analysis, and they're going to guide the discussion at the end when he reflects back on, okay, what did we learn? So we read this, and then he comes to the method. And the method is basically, how did I design my study and what did I do? So in this case, I believe he has a case, a multi-case study or comparative case study. And here he says, this is how I selected my school. So this is important. You want to think about, okay, so what kind of design? Comparative case study. So that goes in your notes. Site selection. Where did he do this study? 5 high schools. That goes in your notes. That's really important because, again, recall that he said other studies are mainly focused on elementary schools. So now we know that we have research on high schools and elementary schools. Here's some description of the high schools. This is important because it gives you a sense of how well the findings are going to, we say, generalize to other contexts. So for example, if he had studied, these are all pretty white schools except for this one. And this one's pretty diverse as well. But we might say here in Texas, in Houston, we might say, well, those white schools, I'm not sure what I can learn from them because they're just so different from my context. So it's important to have a sense of not only, okay, it was high schools, but what were those high schools like? Here's some more about the participants, the people he interviewed. This is important as well. You don't need to worry about taking specific notes. You might notice, okay, how many people is he interviewing across these schools? Who are these people? Are most of them white males? Again, not that that's a bad thing, but you might just say, wow, that doesn't really, what does that mean for my context? Or if you're interested in this subject, in this topic area, you might say, wow, he interviewed all white males. What about women? What about people of color? I'm going to do my own study that focuses on their perspective. So we take notes to make sure that we understand what we've read and we can go back and review them, but we also keep those notes and we take this level of detailed notes so we can be really critical of what are we reading. Okay, this is a great article, but most of his schools were predominantly white, or most of his participants were this or that. And I know that I can add to the literature by focusing on a different set of participants. So you might just take a note. Wow, lots of white schools, lots of big schools, lots of small schools, lots of rural schools, lots of urban schools. It says more about his participants. This is another section that's important, data collection. How were data collected? I believe he did these interviews. Maybe he didn't, though, do any observations, and you decide that that is a limitation later. So again, good to note, okay, data were all collected via interview. Data analysis, qualitative coding. So he talks about 2 rounds of coding. Here's one, here's the second round of coding. This is really important, again, because you want to make sure that you understand how it was executed and do you think it was executed as well as it could have been. And then we get to the findings. This is where he's going to tell us, well, what did I learn? So he gives this nice little summary of the findings, and then he digs in deep. Depending on, this is where I decide how important this article is based on my reading so far, how important the article is for my own reading. You're going to get to the point for your thesis where you're reading a couple articles, if not more than that, per week, because it's just going to take that much reading to become an expert in your thesis topic. Some of those articles you're going to read really deeply. Some of those articles you're going to read more efficiently. Findings is a place where I often make that distinction, because I may say, I don't need to read these really carefully. What I need is the big picture. I need to take away what are the important points and what are the important contributions of this article. So if this was an article that was really important for my work, which it happens to be personally, I would read all of this very carefully, and I would take notes on all the key findings and try to even pull in some of his quotations or quotations from his work about what each finding means. If this was not such an important, I didn't think this was such an important piece for my own reading, for my own thinking, for my thesis, I may read this part here, the findings, which is really nice, this nice paragraph. Not all articles are going to have this, in which case you'll have to skim the findings and pull out, okay, finding 1, finding 2, finding 3. And then I would skip to, jump down to the discussion. The discussion is where the author is going to say, this is the new information that we have learned from my study, and this is how my study contributes to existing conversations. So some findings may be consistent with prior research, some findings may be totally different. So for example, he writes here, the primary conclusion of the study is that instructional leadership practice, the practice of providing feedback, appears bound within distinct subject subcultures that are a product of the administrator's past experience as a classroom teacher. What does that mean? Basically, administrator is limited by their own content knowledge. That's really important. That's the main takeaway from this whole article. That's what you want to walk away from reading the findings section and the discussion. And so that's why I say, if this is not a central article, I would read that, skim for those main points, and then focus on the discussion. If this is a very important article, read the whole results section, but also make sure that you have a clear understanding at the end. What is the takeaway? And this colleague happens to write really nicely and very clearly. Not all authors are going to lay it out as nicely as he has, but this is the kind of language you want to dig for. The primary contribution, the primary conclusion, the main point, the key findings. This is what we're looking for here. And this is what you would take notes on. And then this is all interesting. These are sort of additional ways in which the author believes or argues that the work contributes to our understanding of instructional supervision. And then he lays out some of these limitations. And oftentimes this is pulled out in its own section called limitations. Not always. Here it is not. So while this study provides new insights about instructional leadership in schools, the study is limited and further research is needed. This is really important, one, because you want to start to learn to read critically and understand, wow, there is this new knowledge, but these are the places where the study falls short, the study, maybe these are some points that are beyond the study's scope, these were not feasible. Those are the types of things you want to keep an eye out for, because they also will help you think about, okay, well, if there's this research gap, then we need my research to address that research gap. So that is a qualitative article. He includes the appendix, and then at the end will be the references. So let's go ahead and take a look. It's a good place to pause your video if you need a break. I'm going to switch gears now and look at the quantitative paper. The quantitative paper, similar here. Title, this is the journal article, the journal name, the year, the volume, the issue, the pages, and a nice abstract. This is shorter, you can see, it's not structured. Just gives you an overview of the article and its key findings. So here we go. Here's some background. This is about disproportionate discipline, which basically means that refers to the over-disciplining of Black males in particular. And so this is some background, right? Maybe some statistics. And then this is what you see here. This is very short. This is it. This is the introduction right here. So contrast that with the other article, which had maybe a 2-page introduction. And what we need to find here is, okay, where is their contribution? And so what they're talking about here is this compounding, right? So this cumulative effect. So in this article, here's the purpose right here. Here's the purpose statement. We first present an attribution-based approach to understand disciplinary disproportionality, which basically means we're trying to explain why this happens. And then we are going to, where you say we review what is known, basically they say we are going to give you our lit review. And then we have our study. So this is a study of pre-service, what pre-service teachers think about student behavior, and whether those beliefs that the pre-service teachers have depend on whether the student is Black or is white. Unlike the previous article we read, which started with what we already know, just the lit review, this article is structured somewhat differently. It starts with, how are we going to approach our study? So here you see theoretical framework. So that's a signal to you. This is their approach. They are going to, in this case, it's a theory. So this is the attribution-based theory of stereotypes. So basically, the idea that we have stereotypes about each other and about groups of people, and that those stereotypes shape our beliefs and most likely our actions. So they're going to explain the theory. So in your notes, you could say theory and then name it. You might want to pull out some key references. So one thing I didn't mention when we were going through the previous article is that when you aren't sure where to look next for your next article, mine each article you read for authors that you should read next. So for example, if you want to learn more about stereotypes, well, maybe you can read these guys right here, Wheeler and Fisk. I don't know who they are, but it might be relevant for your research if you're reading this article. So they kind of go through the theory, some of the research, the empirical support for this theory, and then they lay out their research questions. They say, given the approach we're going to take, these are the questions we're going to answer. So 2 questions: do pre-service teachers interpret a student's behavior differently depending on that student's race? And then 2, do pre-service teachers' beliefs about how they would respond to a student's behavior differ according to that student's race? So that's 1 question about beliefs and a second question about potential responses. Then they get into their lit review, which, if you recall, is the what do we already know about this? And if this is your topic, reading this section pretty closely is important because it helps you think about, well, what should I know about this? What do I need to know about this? You'll see, for example, similar names will pop up over and over and over again. And that's a signal to you, okay, I need to go look up this Skiba person, and I need to go look up this Lawson person. I need to read those articles. And you can, of course, just go to the bibliography, find the articles, pop the name, the title into Google Scholar, and look them up and pull down the PDF and read it. So again, the literature review is not a place that I ever skim because I want to make sure I understand the issue as best as I can, and I understand the trajectory of the conversation. What have people been talking about and writing about and researching? So that when I join this party, I don't sound like an idiot, but I sound like I'm up to date, I'm on top of it, and I'm ready to contribute. So I'm taking notes on each of these headings. Maybe I'm popping in some bullets and sub-bullets with points. In some cases, really nice quotes with the page number so that you know where it came from. So we have so here this is the extent, right? So how common is this? And then what happens to kids when they're suspended? Why do we care about this? So here's some potential explanations for why Black boys might be overly disciplined. This is what previous research suggests. And their study comes in and says, okay, so we have this other research that says, okay, disproportionality could be because of the kid, could be because of this bias, could be because of this, could be because of that. Their theory that they've adopted, this attribution-based stereotype theory, is their contribution to these existing explanations. They're going to say, okay, this is fine. Here's what we already know. Here's the limitations with what we already know. Right? They jump in here and say, research that other people have done is great, but it only gets us so far. It leaves open these questions. So this is important because this is the problem that the authors are addressing with their study. So we talked about this with the first article. The first article, the author put this right at the beginning. Here it's a little bit buried, but it's there. So this is the research problem. And their study is meant to start to address this research problem. So you want to have a good understanding of, okay, what is that gap? And then at the end, you can try to critically evaluate, well, did they really address that gap? How much traction did they get in, quote unquote, filling that gap? So here we read it, and then we get to, oh, okay, the present study. This is what we did in this study. And so here I believe they have a vignette that they present to these pre-service teachers. So they describe that here. So here it is. The method, they talk about who the participants are. And in this case, you'll see some of this, we start to see that the traces of this is a statistical analysis. We have an N, which basically means the sample size. So they have 76 women. Most of them are men. Most of them are white, Caucasian or white. And then we have information about where they are in their studies, how they were sampled, and here where it says measure, basically they say how we measured the stereotype that we were hoping to measure. And so they describe, they describe what they showed their participants. So they read them this vignette. What varies across the vignette, as you can see in the next section, is that sometimes the student in the vignette has a white name. Sometimes the student has a sort of quote unquote typical Black name or African American name. And then they measure the pre-service teacher's responses. So this was a experimental condition, which they describe. And then they talk about what we say are dependent variable. That's the outcome. So this manipulation, the name, is the independent variable. This is what changes. This is what the researchers change. The dependent variable is the outcome they're trying to measure. So they were trying to measure the impact on the dependent variable. So here we can see, okay, how was it measured? So they had these responses, these scales. Okay, you want to make sure, okay, is that sound reasonable? Is that a good way to measure these variables? Are there any potential limitations? In your early reading, you may not yet have the analytic tools to think about, okay, this is a good way to do it or a bad way to do it. But the deeper you get into the research, the more you'll be able to say, okay, everybody else did it this way. Why did this person do it this other way? And there may be a very good reason, but you want to know and you want to be able to assess that. Then they tell us, okay, how did we analyze the data? And here are the results. And again, of course, here we can see that this is a quantitative study because they have some graphs and they have some more numbers, right? They're talking about a confidence interval. And the key, if you feel intimidated when you read the statistical analyses, the key to take away is, what does it mean? Oftentimes, if you're not sure about the statistics, you can skim this, and where you're going to get the quote unquote answer is skim, 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 skim is the discussion. In the discussion, they're going to say, kind of give you an overview. These were my main findings. This is how they contribute to the literature in the way that I told you at the beginning I was going to try to contribute to the literature. So for example, here they have, we sought to identify, in particular, we wanted to do this, and we did this. So we found that pre-service teachers who were assigned to read either questionnaire featuring the Black student did rate the behavior as being more likely to recur. However, so there was an effect. Interestingly, however, these participants did not select notably more stable causes. So then they get into the findings from their second question. So again, don't be intimidated by the statistics, because in the discussion, the authors will almost always give you those, okay, this is what we found. This is why it matters. This is how we have advanced the conversation. And that's why I want you to really focus on the discussion. Put that in your notes. Okay, these are the main points. This is how these are the key contributions. And then don't forget to make sure you find the limitations part. So future research, this is where they're saying we weren't able to touch all of this, or our findings led to new questions. Because again, this is going to help you think about, well, where do I come in? Where in the world am I going to get my research agenda from? It's going to come in part out of deep reading of these discussions. So here we have some limitations, right? Our findings are limited by the relatively small sample size. The participants maybe are not very representative. So again, these are limitations that open the door for your study. And so that is generally how you want to, what you should be pulling from each article you read, how to focus your reading, how to take some notes. Make sure you're always looking for the problem, the purpose and or research questions, that existing literature. So what do we already know before this study? How does this author approach this topic in a new way. So their theoretical or conceptual approach, their methods, how did they go about designing and executing the study, their findings, and again, don't get bogged down in the details of the findings and the statistics or in the lots and lots and lots of interview data. Focus on what's in the discussion, because again, that gives you the highlight and tells you why they matter. And as you read, you'll get better at picking out, okay, this is the important information, which will make your reading more efficient. You'll know, okay, this is an article I have to read more carefully. This is an article I can skim. And that way you'll spend less time. You'll be able to read more. And again, make sure you take notes so that you're able to document everything you're learning and you know where you can go back to find that information, so you're not just always, oh, I have to just go reread the article again. In some cases, you're going to have to, but you don't want that to be every case, because that will make your life miserable, because there's just too much to read out there. With that, I will leave you, and I look forward to being part of this journey with you this semester, because we're going to do a lot of reading.